Really delighted to see all of you here, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar for today, our Futures Forward webinar. It is episode 5 of our first season and the season finale, because as I've been telling everybody, we are not running anything in December. We're going to take a break. So good evening if you're tuning in from the same time zone as Singapore, good night to some of you who are tuning in much later, or even good morning to, depending on where you're coming in from. As you can see in the chat, we have a wonderfully diverse group, and it's really wonderful to see you, see where everybody is from, and to welcome you, to our webinar. So my name is Cheryl Chung. I'm the Program Director of Executive Education Singapore Futures here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And at the start of this year, we had the great pleasure of launching our new webinar series, or then it was new, Futures Forward, and we focused this first season in 2021 on the intersection between futures and public policy, right? So we've spent a lot of time talking about the different public policy applications of futures thinking over a wide range of topics. And I cannot believe that we are in the final episode of the season. Really thanks to the team who has made this all this happen, in terms of all the hard work that they've done to pull this thing together. So whether you are joining us for the very first time or you have been following us through the year, I just wanted to say thank you. We're so happy to see this wonderful, thriving international community of thinkers and practitioners putting their ideas and experiences in futures out into the world. And I'm so glad that you're part of this conversation today. We have just launched our website for this webinar series, and you can check out past episodes on that website. And of course, this one will be on there once we're done and have cleaned up the video and so on. So today's episode is the 5th one of the series, and today we're talking about measuring the impact of foresight on public policy. And I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting question, and I think it's one of the question about impact, especially in public policy, especially in a real world context. What does that look like? Is one of maybe the harder questions to answer in the foresight space. They always say if you can measure it, then you can manage it, you can track it, but then the act of measuring itself also has distorting effects on behavior, so it's quite a complex issue, right? But at the end of the day, those of us who are working in futures work, futures thinking in the foresight space, don't just want to think about the future, right? We actually want to create it. We want to see things happen in the real world. So this impact question is one that, we wrestle with constantly. And an organization, especially a public sector organization's capacity to both do futures work and enable decisions about the future to actually happen, and better decisions about the future to happen is a really important one, right? So we're going to spend this time talking a little bit about examples of how we can maybe improve impact, different ideas, how we might evaluate or measure impact. And I do hope that it will be a wide-ranging and rich discussion. And to weigh in on this extremely important topic, we've got 2 wonderful panelists, and so delighted to see them join us today. First panelist is Rahul Daswani, Head of People and Culture Open Government Products at GovTech, our government technology agency here in Singapore. And the second wonderful panelist, Wendy McGuinness, who is the founder and chief executive of the McGuinness Institute, New Zealand. So really delighted, to welcome both of you, and especially Wendy, because I only realized today how late it is for you, but really appreciate both of you spending this time together with us. So without further ado, I'm going to just jump straight into the conversation. Just as a little bit of a kind of setting the structure, for the first half of the session, we generally like to hear from the panelists, some introductory remarks, a little bit of ideas of what they've been thinking about relating to the topic. And then the second half, I really like to open the floor up for questions, right? So we do take questions in the Q&A function. So if you see that in the bottom part of your screen, that will be the easiest way to get our attention in terms of the questions. And I will try to moderate them in some, hopefully some coherent fashion, and I hope that this will be a really interesting conversation for the three of us. So thank you very much, everyone. Let's begin, get straight into the topic, and I would love to start with Rahul. So Rahul, as I mentioned, is the head of people and culture at Open Government Products at GovTech Singapore. And I think he's had a really interesting role as an entrepreneur, right? Entrepreneur that works in organizations, which actually is its own challenge and its own incredible skill set, right? And designing different initiatives, to build capacity and culture, including futures, which is really interesting. And I think your particular experience in the startup phase of teams and of organizations, I think is what is really interesting to me, and one of the issues that I'm hoping that we can touch on a little bit more. How I know Rahul is from the Center for Strategic Futures, where I'm alumni, we're both alumni, and he was involved with the last set of national scenarios, including designing a game, which was, I was just telling Wendy and my colleagues that we played at orientation, actually, at the school, to extremely great success and really, really wonderful feedback, because nobody had thought about immersing themselves into scenarios in such a wonderful way, and also to use game mechanics to explore the agency or lack of agency they might have within a scenario. So just want to commend you on projects like that, which are really, really interesting. So Rahul, maybe if I can invite you to share a little bit, maybe a little bit more about yourself and your work, and some of the thoughts that you might have had recently about the idea of impact of foresight on public policy.
Yeah,
Over
thanks.
to you, Rahul.
Thanks, Cheryl. So I'll start off by a combination of my thoughts of impact and actually what I've been through, because they tend to correlate quite nicely. So as Cheryl said, I started my career at least in futures at the Center of Strategic Futures. And that was really thinking about, I guess you can think about it of three levels, right? There's kind of the purist futurist way, which is like intellectual. What's the intellectual curiosity that you have? Like, what is really out there? Like, what's happening? What are the emerging trends that are happening? Who are the people on the edges, on the fringes of mainstream, but also like not too crazy that we can speak to, understand what's going on the different facets of society, the economy, technology, and the environment, and so on, right? And so the currency or the impact there is, am I getting some of these trends, right? Like, have I caught some of these trends? And you can only tell depending on the amount of traction that you gain with decision makers, and also depending on how the world plays out in a few years, right? So you can only tell, and also depending on the policy changes that actually happen, right? But those are usually policy changes are a consequence of many different things. So it's hard to directly attribute a policy change directly to, oh, you see, I built a scenario, people played this immersive game, and therefore the policy was changed. It's not so straightforward. But I think if you can have conversations where people are reflective, and as Cheryl said, what the game was really useful was to get people into a space where they ended up being very emotional. And when you're emotional, then you think, hey, there's something here, right? There's something here that needs to be adjusted. I thought that we live in a meritocracy, but I experienced in the game that actually, no matter what I did, actually I couldn't get anywhere. And so maybe we need to relook some of our policies that assume meritocracy, right? So I think that's a kind of purest way of thinking about it. I think what I realized after in my consequent roles is that actually, in some ways, everybody is trying to influence the future, right? I mean, that's what we're all doing. We're trying to make the future better for ourselves, for our family at the very least. Some people are trying to do it for a particular community, some people for a country, some people for the world, right? And there's no right or wrong answer. It's just that that's what everybody's trying to do. Futurists do it in a particular way by trying to lay out and imagine what the future looks like. And so that's also part of the impact, I suppose. Like, how compelling a picture can you draw? And are you able to articulate various distinctly different compelling visions of the future? And that's really the strength, right? That's a testament to the impact you can create, because then you can say, oh, do I want world A or B or C? Or which elements of world A, B, or C do I want? And the clearer that is, the clearer the option sets there are, then the easier it is to build bridges for what does that mean now, for what kind of policies I should change, or what kind of conversation should I have, right? But still a bit abstract. The second role that I had was at the Ministry of Home Affairs. And there I led the futures team, but also they parked that together with the resource planning arm of the ministry, right? So it's a division called Strategic Planning and Resources. And so a planning organization was the official title, but really it contained these two functions. And so what they did there was cool, which was like, okay, we'll think about futures, we'll think about strategic planning, but really what we'll do is we'll allocate resources. And here I'm talking about budget, I'm talking about manpower or labor, and I'm talking about land, physical land, based on what we want the world to look like, right? So if we decide here's the pathway for the future, and it involves more technology and less labor, then let's only support projects that are going to be focused on capital intensive but technology intensive, that are going to reduce the demand for labor, if that is the direction that we choose, right? So then I think the levers that you have are more powerful, more direct, right? Because you can say, hey, this is this is what the future that we want, and this is what we can do about it. And if you're not on board, too bad, we won't fund you. Right? So that's cool, because in terms of measurement, you can say how many projects are funding that are directly going to contribute to the goals that I have decided matter to me as an organization, and the future that I want to see, right? Is my funding cost effective? What percentage of this am I doing exploratory stuff, and what is the value that I expect ROI on? Like if I do 10 exploratory projects, what is the kind of value that I expect if one of them really takes off and is a moonshot, right? So then this one is actually a bit easier to measure and a bit easier to influence, because you have both the futures unit and the resource planning, which is the main lever, at least in government, for getting stuff done, on the same page. So you can really align those two, the futures work with the implementation, which is the hardest thing really to do about futures work, and that's why we're having this conversation. The third kind of way of doing it is the closest to the ground, right? And I think some people might think I've given up, on being a futurist, but that's not true, right? Because my current role is head of people and culture at Open Government Products. For those who don't know, Open Government Products is the experimental arm of GovTech. The broad concept is, what if we reimagine what government would look like and feel like if we operated like a modern tech company, but solving public sector problems? What would that be like? And in some ways, that is the future, I think. And so for me, I realized actually what I really like is not necessarily hypothetically trying to convince people of where they should go, which you're trying to do in the first case, right? In a CSF case, like, let me persuade you, whether it's through a game or otherwise, of where to go. I'm like, let me just build you and show you what the future looks like now, right? And if I can show you what it looks like now, then that's a way more compelling case than hypothetical arguments, especially with people who are, in Singapore, we're known as quite a competent government. The downside to having competent government is people feel like, why should I listen to you, right? Because I'm competent. So do I really need to listen to somebody else? And they have their own arguments that they prepared as well for defending the current way things are done. So in order to overturn that, it's not easy. As you know, Cheryl, like we're really creative at CSF in terms of how you persuade people, but it ain't easy, because everybody has their own agenda and has their own competencies, and that's really, really hard. So what I decided is actually the best way to convince people is to show them, what the future looks like right now. And so when I joined Open Government Products just over 2 years ago, I said people and culture, what I said is, let's build from first principles what is a modern era people and culture environment. And that should be for any high performing organization, not just in government. Let me take the best principles from the fastest growing and the largest organizations that exist now, which is predominantly tech organizations. Let me understand how they became so high performing so quickly. Let me reimagine performance management. So we don't use CEP. For those of you who know, it's like this subjective idea of what potential is. We don't use normal distributions or quota, because actually that's quite outdated in the private sector. Rather than use relative ranking of of making people compete against each other in today's environment where actually your currency is collaboration. Let's actually use an absolute model that is very clear and transparent about where you need to go for you to progress in your career. And let's be upfront about it, right? Let's have these transparent, hard discussions, but let's have these hard discussions so people know and understand the decisions that are made around their performance, and then they can choose to optimize accordingly. If they want to optimize for a hybrid role and optimize for impact, let's do that and let's recognize and reward them for that, then like purely on a competency basis. But let's be upfront about what's going on here, right? So I reimagine performance appraisal, and that's kind of a fundamental building block, because until and unless people feel like I know what I'm working towards, I know what I want, it's clear to me what I'm being measured against, then it is very difficult for people to say, I'll give my best and I'll put my 100%, because you're playing a game where you're in a maze and you're blindfolded otherwise, right? You're like, well, I don't know if the amount of effort I put in these directions is going to be rewarded and recognized or not. So why should I? Why should I put in the effort? Because it doesn't seem like it's necessarily going to get rewarded. I don't know what's going to work, and I just kind of spread my effort or spread myself thin. So that's, I think, really at the core of any person who wants to influence the future in a different way. You gotta make something tactile, right? That's really at the core. In any of these three, you gotta make it tactile. You gotta make it digestible. You gotta make it for people that like, okay, like I get it. I get what you're saying, and I understand it, and I understand how it will relate to me. Right? That's what you do. So I'm like, hey, these are the principles by which we operate. I measure these principles. So every 6 months when we run a performance cycle, I'm like, hey, how was the overall experience for you? How was the quality of feedback for you? Do you understand? How well do you understand the reason for the performance grade that you were given? And I ask people this, and I use the responses, not just the quantitative, but I ask them qualitative questions to iterate and to improve the model and the system that we build, so that every time it gets better and better and better. Sometimes we make experiments and they don't work out, by the way, I'll be honest, right? But that's really the way of the future. Is actually, it costs much less to experiment now, and we should default as much as possible to action and trial and experimentation over like, let's figure out the best possible plan that will work in like 1 or 2 or 5 years. Let's just try it out for a few months. How do we do remote working super well and increase engagement? Is we tried out different things. We tried out Notion and we tried out Discord, and we said, hey, one of these is going to fail. One of these is better than the other. We don't know which one yet. Rather than doing comprehensive analysis, why don't the whole team just test it out? And then we see whichever one people land on, right? And that only took a period of 2 weeks, as opposed to some study somebody might have done and have individual biases, and we're like, hey, why don't we just do this, right? And so that is the way in which I started off, right, for the first 2 years, which is, hey, how do we do hiring and performance management in this new world? How do we do learning development in this new world where we want a lot more autonomy for people? Because 100 brains doing 100 things is much better than one brain saying, hey, here's 100 things you have to do, right? I mean, this is the modern economy. So let's make sure we take advantage of that and the drive and the initiative of our people, rather than relegating that or deferring that up to some single person's idea of leadership. No matter how good they are, you're not going to beat other countries or play at the same field or the same level if you're not taking advantage of what all your people have to offer. So 2 years I spent building the model, right, iterating, building the model, and now I'm at a stage where the rubber hits the road, and we're saying, I mean, it's been generally accepted as robust. We've produced products. So for those who don't know, we built the vaccine.gov.sg website, which is the site in which Singaporeans book their vaccines. We built code.gov.sg in a period of like 2 weeks, which is clear communication around the policies, because the policies change. So what's the latest, what's happening now, FAQs, can you check if you're eligible for home quarantine, certain things that you need to check eligibility, just key in your own details, and then it will tell you, yes, you're eligible, no, you're not, right? Which is actually what people want to do. And what we found is really, we focused a lot on like user centricity, actually, like what's best for the user to use as opposed to for government to track, right? Because they can be built quite differently, and you get a very different experience as a user, and you will know which one it is when you use a product or a site, right? And so now that we've generally accepted, we build things at 10 times cheaper than a lot of other products in government. they're as reliable from a security point of view, and that they're really, really user-friendly and gain widespread adoption. Now the question is, how do we take those principles and translate them to government? And that's where I want to measure my impact, right? So I'm just moving to a role called head of partnerships. And really the idea is, how can we have partnerships and influence other parts of government to adopt more progressive ways of working, whether it's in the building technology side, which, in terms of using the cloud effectively, and cybersecurity practices that are modern and robust and quick, but also on the people side and the organization side. So how do we then get, because part of the impact is building the model, which I did, and my colleagues did on the tech side. And now it's like, well, what is the impact on other parts of government if they adopt parts of this? And what's the impact both in two ways? One, outwardly, like what is the impact on the users, on the citizens, on the residents using their products, and the agencies themselves, but also what is the impact on the organization? How are people feeling? How productive are they? Are they happy and are they engaged? And these are real things that are really important if you want to build a long-term, productive, happy, growing workforce. So that's what I'm thinking about now in terms of metrics. And I mean, it's kind of the parallel side, right? So at CSF, it's the same kind of thing you want to influence. Are you influencing? And now I'm also trying to influence, but it's coming from very different places. Right. It's the actual physical model, and that's the genesis of this. Whereas for purist kind of futurists, it's like, hey, actually, there's a lot of stuff that I'm seeing that you might not be seeing or making sense of, and actually that should influence some of your decision-making power. But ultimately, the same goal in terms of impact, and it's really about what role do you find yourself excited playing, that you should spend your time on, because then I think you're going to be able to generate way more impact. So that's my short takeaway. We'd love to hear from Wendy and the rest of you if you have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the insight and those different roles, and how that's also it's really nice. I mean, also knowing you personally, it's also really nice to hear how your own thinking has evolved over time, and kind of the different roles that you've played has also kind of shaped the way that you think about impact. I think the main thing I'm taking away from your comments is this, it's kind of like, if you think about futures work as the container, right? And maybe a lot of the typical way that we think about trends and the strategic insights as being the conversations that are happening within the container. What I'm hearing from you is you're trying to rebuild the container itself, right? It's kind of like, you don't want to put new wine into old wine skin and then have it burst, right? Which is basically where 3/4 of this stuff gets derailed, right? Budget and HR, can't get the right people in the right role, you can't spend the money to do the thing that you need to do. And those old wine skins actually also need to be upgraded, and I think that's the key message that I'm hearing from you. And I think the second one is really this, as it's to the Dave Snowden's kind of framework, in terms of, in a complex environment, your strategy is really to probe, sense, and respond, right? That you are actually putting out interventions, that you do want to test and keep on testing. And then scale as you build this model, into 2 years, use your terminology, which is actually quite counterintuitive for the way that a lot of public sector work goes on, right? Because we feel like we need to do the one big plan and then roll it out, systematically. And we have a view that to do it that way is good public policy. But actually, that's maybe not true, right? And I think you're challenging our view to say that actually there are many other ways of doing things, and there's a lot to learn from other organizations who have been high performing and successful, and there are many ideas to take from them as well. Yeah, so thank you very much for your comments. Maybe let's move. Sorry, I see Rahul, you just unmuted.
No, I just want to say thanks. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. We'll come back to you in a little bit, but maybe I'll allow Wendy to also, kind of, we'd love to hear from her in some of opening remarks as well. So Wendy, as I mentioned earlier, is the founder and chief executive of the McGuinness Institute in New Zealand. Really delighted to see her, albeit virtually. I think the last time Wendy and I met each other was at Singapore Foresight Week. Would be a couple of years ago now, where she gave me a wonderful deck of, wonderful deck of cards. This is the problem with the Zoom background. But basically it's a Foresight New Zealand deck of playing cards, and about and I would say conversation starters, right? About what the future of New Zealand might look like, and I love all these artifacts, analog and digital, so was very happy and delighted to see these again. I think one of the things we really love to hear from you, Wendy, is that there have been some really interesting initiatives happening in New Zealand in the last, I think, couple of months. And there was a kind of reform to the public sector or Public Service Act, if I'm not wrong, to introduce this idea of long-term insights briefings, which we were talking about earlier. Is actually quite an interesting, quite unique, I would say, platform, in the futures and public policy space. So I was wondering if you'd be able to firstly share a little bit more about yourself and what you do, and a little bit about these long-term insights briefings. That would be fantastic. So over to you, Wendy.
Okay. Hey, look, firstly, thanks so much for the invitation, Cheryl. And I did have to say, Rahul, that sounded so exciting. And I couldn't wait. I want to come across and do this with you. That sounds brilliant. So a little bit about me. I'm actually, a long time ago, was a trained accountant. And so measurement is something that just pushes all my buttons. So I thought this title was fantastic. And this concept about impact, of course, I'm just into change as well. So thought that was a really great presentation. I think the thing for me that's so fascinating about Foresight is that it really can't be measured in the normal way that we would measure things. And what I mean by that is that we normally think about dystopia futures, which is really what we do with Foresight. And what we try and do is explore all the things that can go wrong. And in my view, we look at the utopia is kind of like the easy stuff. It's a little bit like, the chocolate cake, it's just perfect and everything's gorgeous. But really what we're interested in happening is when things do go wrong, and we want to understand the linkages between everything. So, how do we measure success? We measure success that we didn't end up into some really bad spaces in the utopia, potential possibilities. So measuring is actually that we kind of make that change or develop into a really positive space. And so my own personal journey was accounting, and then finding that what we did, we used to have this sort of system in accounting where we take the last 3 years and sort of make it part of the forecasting for the next 3 years. And of course, that started not sort of working anymore in about the 1980s and 1990s. And that got me really interested in risk management, because I actually realized that reporting mechanism that we had was no longer plausible. And so I studied and did a lot of risk management work. And then, interestingly, the same thing happened in my career. Well, risk management was no longer enough, because basically we were dealing with increasingly complex systems. Everything was hitting against everything else, and there was the order of events and the impacts, and then we had these wild cards. So the situation changed quite significantly, and that dragged me and with great delight into this future space. So I started the think tank in 2004, and 2008 was my first World Futures Conference. And that's when I really started having to listen really carefully to the narratives and the definitions and the methods. And for me, if you like, an accountant, when I was looking at measurement, which of course is really a science, suddenly I have to be in the space of art and narrative, and going to Rahul's point around experimentation, exploring these, fast fail concepts that we do. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that background, and also the role that obviously Singapore has done for the world by creating this amazingly integrated and, I would say, futures ecosystem that feeds us all. And Cheryl, I want to acknowledge that. So that's amazing. So then the exciting thing is, hey, in New Zealand, we've come up with something, and I wanted to share it with you. And so we're going to go to shared screen. And I'm just going to go up here and put it on play from the start. So without further ado, I'll move through the topics. I'm hoping you can see this. I just wanted you to kind of, because I love history. I think it's terribly important. So Singapore started, I think about the early 1970s, really building this Foresight base, and Cheryl, you can correct me later. And New Zealand did it by, we had a piece of legislation that created the Commission for the Future and the New Zealand Planning Council in 1976. The Commission for the Future went from 10 plus years, and the New Zealand Planning Council went for the first 10 years. So that was that relationship. So you had short to medium-term focus, I suppose, and then the longer-term focus. But it didn't ride well. In 1982, the Long-Term Commission for the Future was disestablished by our Prime Minister at the time, which was Prime Minister Muldoon. And one of the reasons for that was it sort of got outside of its area of comfort. It started looking at the nuclear issue, and it started gravitating, depending which we were in this narrative, across into public policy. And of course, you cannot move, cross that line. Singapore may have successfully done that, but I think most countries find that, you can't go into central government policy. We kept the New Zealand Planning Council going on till 1991. And basically at that point of time, that was disestablished, and they created the Crown Research Institutes. And that was meant to actually follow on this embedded journey of foresight in New Zealand government. But I would argue it didn't do that successfully. Probably the terms of reference wasn't very well embedded, and that responsibility wasn't passed on, if you like, the baton wasn't passed on. But that all changed really excitingly in 2020 with this new change in legislation, which you referred to, Cheryl, as the long-term insights briefing. Might come back to that slide in a moment, but so these are the three pieces of legislation that were instrumental, and New Zealand does like to legislate, thank goodness, in many ways, because it keeps a really great record for all of us. But so this shows the New Zealand Planning Act, which you can see there in 1977, which established those two organisations I talked about, the Crown Research Institutes in 1992, and then we have the public, I'm just going to make sure I get everything there, Public Service Act 2020. So I think that was August 2020. I was just going to clarify that for you. So so that was quite a strategic change in name of the legislation, but it was also allowed for this particular schedule that was developed in the back of that act. And the reason it was put in place was because there was a perceived lack of priority given to long-term thinking in the public service. And there was a gentleman actually head of our Public Service Commission, Peter Hughes, who actually was really, my understanding, quite instrumental in developing this as a concept about how we might increase that priority of long-term thinking and public policy. So it was a very strategic and targeted tool to try and put foresight back into public policy. The piece of legislation itself you can see in front of you, and now Cheryl will understand why I asked if I could show you the slides, because there's nothing like actually seeing it in law, is there? So, so importantly, this was actually put an obligation on chief executives. Now, I'm not sure what other nation states out there, how they deal with this, but this put an obligation on the chief executives of the government departments. So it once again had that linear difference from the Crown and the government and House of Representatives, and it actually puts that obligation onto the head of our chief executives of our government departments. and they have this one-off opportunity, an obligation, a responsibility, at least every 3 years, that they kind of come clean with what they think. Now, you'll see there's a little logo right down the bottom there in yellow. You probably cannot see it properly, but it's the concept of a brain, and it's Chromecasting. And it's meant to be the chief executive's brain of a government department, Chromecasting their thoughts every 3 years. So that's our little logo to explain what was happening. But anyway, you can see the purpose of the briefing is to make available into the public domain information about medium and long-term trends, risks, and opportunities. It also asks for the chief executive to do some consultation on the subject matter, and you can also in terms of the draft of the briefing. So it's got a quite specific and narrow focus. The paper is actually tabled in the House, and I'm hoping that that there will be some sort of I'm just going to see what's happened here. Don't you love it when it does? Sorry, I'll just do that. What you can see in front of you now is the examples of all the briefings that are out for consultation or have closed. So you can kind of have a look at that in the PowerPoint slide if you want to at a later stage. I'm obviously not going to talk those through now. It's just to give you a bit of a taste. What we've done, within there'll be a few faces there, Cheryl will know. One is Roger Dennis, of course, who's been very involved with Singapore, but even more importantly, David Skilling, who lives there, which is fantastic, and Rahul, who you can see, Karakuli, who is the School of Government in Victoria. So the four of us did a webinar on talking about this to the public service. So this is giving you a practical example. And then we did a survey of the people that attended the webinar. And then we actually took those results and presented them to the select committee. And it was the chairs of all the select committee, basically to let them know what was coming up and answer their questions. So in terms of a practical solution, it was actually trying to basically put a bit more of a torch onto this instrument with a view that we increase our ambition and expectations from this tool, which I think is terribly exciting. One of the surveys I just wanted to share with those of you that are interested in integrated thinking, when we asked the participants the question of whether they would prefer single briefings or joint briefings, the legislation actually allows for government departments to group together on a topic, and you can see completely 82.93% wanted joint briefings on a shared topic. Cheryl, have I still got another moment or not?
Maybe let's hold the COVID question for the next round, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine. I'll finish there. That's great. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think for me, it's really interesting to see, that also this is legislated, right? And it's such a formal commitment, which I think really also gives a sense of the importance, that this has been put on these long-term insights briefings. I do really like the idea of the joint briefings, because I think one of the challenges about long-term and emergent issues is that actually they don't fit within government silos, right? And if you are narrowing it down to organizations, then climate change becomes only an environmental issue as opposed to an economic, labor, that kind of thing. So I think that also presents a lot of really interesting opportunity to explore these emergent properties, of some of these long-term trends and challenges. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Wonderful. So maybe I think that this is a good point to maybe start to get into a little bit more of a discussion. So I think for both of you, Rahul and Wendy, one question that's come up a lot in our classes, especially from the public sector side. So this morning I taught in our public management class on futures, and there's always this question around like, how has COVID impacted, this idea of futures work, the way that we think about impact, whether it's become better or worse, and I one of the responses I have is that, it becomes a bit of a double bind, right? On the one hand, you see the importance and the potential impact of a sustained futures practice in the ability to be prepared for crises, like COVID. But at the same time, you also see this everybody fighting COVID ops problem, right? And then actually having no time for long-term thinking. So I'm curious to hear from the two of you, how do you think COVID and this time and season, this curious season that we are in, has impacted this question about foresight impact in public policy? And maybe we can start with Rahul and then move on to Wendy. That would be great.
Sure. So, the challenge with COVID is everybody goes into ops mode, right? People are like, I don't have time for the future. I need to solve the crisis right now. And for me, actually, what that signals is the actual importance of segregating out or carving out people who are dedicated towards long-term thinking, because I don't think it makes sense to stop thinking about the future in almost any context, right? Yeah, COVID especially, because it's a long-standing thing that's gone on over about almost 2 years now. Actually, you can't stop futures work for 2 years. You can't just say, let me put that on the back burner, because by the time you come back to it, actually we're in the future already, right? So that's not a good solution. So instead, I think the question is, what are the urgent and critical problems you need to solve, and let's make sure there are enough resources to cover that, right? Because that is important. But how can we at the same time also think about what are the COVID-like events that are going to happen in the future? And they may not be pandemics, by the way, but events or situations or environments or contexts that are going to affect so many people, and let's make sure that we are prepared in some way for those, building on the experience that's happened in COVID, right? And I think that's the important part, is to take the learnings from what happened in COVID, and whether it's about scaling up or scaling down capacity in healthcare. This is just a particular example in healthcare, but what about other capacities that exist in other environments that we may need to scale up or scale down? Are we prepared to make those transitions quickly or not, right? And how can we think about infrastructure in a more adaptable way than the traditional way of like, oh, this one is, this is what we've catered and that's all, right? And it should be enough or it's not enough, right? But how can we be flexible about thinking about infrastructure? That's one of the lessons from COVID, and how can we think about that and apply that into other contexts? But not just that, of course, right? It's like, what are the skills that involve? Who is valuable in our society? Because in COVID, suddenly you saw people who, from a salary point of view, are paid really little money, but actually are essential workers. And this approach of saying, oh, you're a superhero, but superheroes also are not paid very much, right? So is that sustainable? Is that tenable as a model? What kind of model do we want our society to be? These are difficult questions that COVID has posed for us. And this is an opportunity for us to think long-term about what kind of society we want to have, so that when a different crisis happens, are we going to be in a similar situation where people feel undervalued and overworked and they're critical? Or have we already redesigned system and structure of societies so that when we're prepared, actually the wheels can get going in a way that is sustainable and long-term, actually we can last and we can be quite resilient through crises. So that is the learning from COVID, and really the test is in the next big thing that happens. How are we going to respond, and how's our system set up? And that's really what we can measure, right? How is the system set up, and what are the implications of the people who are going to be hardest hit and hardest implicated in such a future situation? What is their life going to look like, and what does our life look like as a collective society as a response to the next big event?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I suppose I have a view that I'm really interested why the world didn't respond. So we knew something was going to happen. The coronavirus, I think it was 1960 when it was found to be between humans, or the first time it was found in humans, and before that it was in animals. And we knew, I think there was probably, 7 or 8 situations with coronavirus that had happened since 2000. So we knew that it was going to happen. And I think we all knew that it mightn't have been the coronavirus, but we knew a pandemic was possible. And this is the problem, isn't it? These things that happen from a long way away that are perhaps not so good. New Zealand had a massive eruption in the middle of our North Island, the biggest eruption in about the year 282 or something like this. In the Roman Empire, New Zealand had the eruption of the Roman Empire. And these eruptions, of course, are massively significant, but thank goodness we don't have them very often. So how do we put these kind of really big impacts? And so that's one way. Why couldn't we take what we knew was going to happen, and why couldn't we actually put the effort in for the risk management and the WHO and the investment? You know, we could be so much cleverer and smarter, couldn't we? And then you take on board, well, is that not the lesson of the pandemic for us? Is that we have a similar crises with obviously climate change, and we also have another one with biodiversity. And, you know, if we fail at the pandemic, which is so obvious and short term to us, and, you know, people die, how come we can't do that better? And therefore, what would be the lessons that we could then reapply to climate change and reapply to biodiversity? And I think that is both, you know, the crux of the problem, but also the opportunity that COVID delivers us as mankind about finding a way forward. Now, so we've kind of got this, you know, stuff happening here, and the urgency is absolutely concerning. But then I take all of that and I look back at the last 100 years, and I think actually they had some pretty difficult issues they had to deal with the 100 years, and they got through it. And maybe actually this pandemic is just a little wake-up call for us all to get our act into gear. And as Rahul was saying, you know, we actually get out and make stuff happen. And we use this as a learning exercise and really, really engage globally. And that's kudos to you, Cheryl, for bringing the world together in this webinar, because I think the world can solve this.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, I think this preparedness question is a really important one, right? And how I think one of the key things about getting impact in the real world from Foresight work is to move from the futures thinking to actually doing prototyping, which is so much of the core of also what Rahul has been sharing, you know, and actually getting things done in the real world, right? You know, building stuff. You know, and not just talking, you know, about the different ideas. That's important too, you know, but how do we take it to the next step, and what are the structures that we're able to actually do those innovative things, right? I think that's really, really interesting. And, you know, the capacity, you know, that you talked about, Rahul, I mean, it also exists in open government products, right? It's not just capacity in the healthcare sector. It's also retaining the capacity within the public sector to innovate in tech. You know, which might be a little bit counterintuitive in the way that we think about, you know, how do we, what are civil service capacities and competencies, right? But a new generation civil service needs, you know, needs to be set up differently, you know, so such an important set of questions. I do want to start to bring in some of the conversation from the rest of, you know, the audience here. And thank you so much, everyone who's been putting questions into the Q&A. You know, we'll start to segue into some of these questions now and these discussions. So we do have a question from, I think it was Song Han for Rahul. So he was saying that he's curious to hear about the journey in diffusing these best practices, right? I suppose this is also the scale question that you're talking about in the next phase of your work as well. You know, in terms of you know, the kind of problems that you're charged up to solve going forward. You know, and talking a little bit. So Sohan is asking a little bit about firstly questions around alignment, what are the best practices, any power dynamics to, navigate, how do you communicate, the return on investment for futures work. A bit of a multi-layered question there, but throwing it over to you, Rahul.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Sohan. So I will say that it's hard, and I'm at the early kind of part of the journey, right? But what is working well in a way is the acceptance that there's an alternative model and it's useful, right? And that has to be kind of the anchor for the starting point, right? So the starting point, actually nobody argues with that. A better model exists and it's out there, and actually we built it. So then the question is, in a large organization, any large organization, especially in the civil service, which is 150,000 people or so, there's going to be resistance, right? Because that's just the way organizations work. It's kind of self-preservation. There's going to be resistance. So the question is how to overcome that resistance. Essentially, the way to do it is there are a couple of ways I'll talk about it. So one is momentum. How do you get the momentum to do it? The traditional way is to say, let's get top-down alignment, right? Let's get the people at the top to say this is critical, and then let that cascade down and let people do it. The problem with like futures-oriented work and longer-term stuff is actually that's necessary but insufficient for things to happen, because making the organization better, fortunately or not, it's just not on people's work plan, right? It's not my work plan for the year. That's not what I have to deliver. I have to deliver certain KPIs, and I need to do what I do to deliver those KPIs, right? And I'm not going to be measured by how well the organization is doing, really, right? And so if you just did the strategy of let me just tell all the top people, and I did actually, right? Because I sent some emails. I'm like, hey, yeah, actually it's a better model, and then they sent it down to like their HR, and then I just never heard from them again, right? Because it's like it's kind of a cold email. Like people are like, let me see. I don't think this is really important. I'm just gonna leave it out. So that's insufficient. So one of the key factors that I look at when thinking about partnerships is actually, can I find somebody who really believes in this? Like, who are the believers in this work? Maybe they just haven't seen it in this form before. Maybe they didn't know it's possible in a public service to operate in this way, but they're really excited about it and they're willing to put it into practice. They're keen, they're excited about it. Let me find those people, right? And one of the advantages of being public service for the last 7 years is actually I kind of know these people. Plus, like, because we're open government products, I know some of the people, but because we're open government products and the fundamental philosophy open is let's open source everything, and not just a code. And a code for our products is open source on GitHub, and you can get it and you can build products because we've benefited so much from the open source community. But let's also open source how we work. And let's put that up on our site with the idea also that, hey, I don't claim to have a monopoly on the best practices for a high performing organization. I don't even presume that I have the best practices themselves. So if I put this out there, actually I'm going to get feedback from other organizations. They're going to help me iterate and refine my own processes, and that's going to be really helpful for me and my policies and my tools, and I'm going to hear back, right? So why not I put it out there, and in the process of hearing that, I also iterate and we become even better as an organization, right? So knowing that there is that humility, that's really helpful, because then it's not that pressure on us. It's not a pressure on the civil service to say you have to do this because it's the best absolute thing in the world since sliced bread, right? It's okay. It's an ongoing thing, and the pressure is lower because it's like, okay, let's try this out, because for now we know that this is better than the existing model. So let's move towards something like this, and let's customize it and let's adapt it, because it's not a plug and play thing. Like you may not have the risk tolerance or the rapid pace of change that you have at OGP, but that's okay. Let's adapt this to what this means for your context. And if you have some people in an organization who are willing to do this and willing to withstand the bureaucratic challenges of doing so, then that is really, really a huge avenue for success. So I'm starting actually with those people. The other thing that I would say is, in large organizations, there are often these like big myths, and we were fortunate that we had this extended we had this outside external consultants in the public sector, but there was a organizational development course that was like, how do you do large scale change in public service? And 3 people externally were kind enough to do it on OGP and how OGP can influence the rest of the system. And essentially, what they found is like there are 3 big myths going on that are really bottlenecking us from scaling. The first myth is, oh, you can do it, OGP, you can do it because you're a tech organization. Organizations that are non-technical cannot do what you're doing. As if there is some magic formula, you're a tech organization, therefore you can do. And so for me, it's really about how can I bust. I'll tell you quickly what the myths are. So one is your tech organization can do, we are not, so we cannot do. Second is, oh, you are so small, you're less than 50 people, therefore you can be nimble, you can change. Big organization cannot, right? And the third is, oh, there's so much bureaucratic things that I have to comply with. Like I will never get permission to be exempt, like you. So therefore I can't be so adaptable, right? These are the three big myths that this team found when they talked to a bunch of people to say, hey, actually, why you're not adapting these practices that you've seen and you've said are robust, right? And so my strategy is, let me bust these myths. Let me work specifically with people who are non-technical in nature, and I'm working with CSF actually to build a career schema and implement some of the performance management work. Let me work with large organizations, and we're working in great depth with MOH, because I mean, you take advantage, you be opportunistic, right? MOH right now is in a situation where they need to operate really quick, really nimble, really need to take advantage of what open source or whatever commercial tools are out there to be able to respond quickly to all the different queries that are coming in, right? And finally, let me find an organization where I can help them hack the bureaucracy, and say, because there is the alignment already, the ministers have said, actually, this is a great model. We'd be happy to support any organization that wants to try some version of this, but cascading that is non-trivial, right? So for me to tell people, hey, I'm happy to help you hack the bureaucracy is very strange sounding to people. They're like, really? Like, that's not how it works, right? And so I'm in the process of finding a case study and building one. And so I want to be able to show that actually these myths that you think about are not true. And if I can do that, then I think that really de-bottlenecks us and will help us to scale much more dramatically. But it's about having the awareness to understand what these ideas are, the mindsets and the assumptions that exist, so that I can then figure out a plan that really challenges these assumptions, which is a very futurist kind of thinking and model. Yep.
Fantastic. And I mean, I love the comments about challenging and questioning the assumptions, right? Because that, like you say, it's a core part of futurist tool set. But I think the other thing was really about demonstration projects, right? That when we say scale, I mean, of course, government can scale, right? Because because of its coercive power. But innovation, right? What does that look like? And responsible innovation within a public sector, what does that start to look like? And what I'm taking from you is this idea of deliberative practice as well, right? That you're actually in a practice of innovating, testing different features, seeing whether they work, going back. And that in itself, again, is a skill set which is maybe a little bit beyond futures work, but so critical to seeing that long-term impact is really, really wonderful to see. Okay, I think there was quite an interesting question around, and kind of also riffing off, maybe the previous one. Also about the role, right? When do you hand off to the public sector innovators? What is the role of futures advisors, and so on? And I think that here it's talking a little bit about maybe where's the limits of futures work in the public sector. At what point do you hand off? And who do you partner with, right? I think one question that we in the futures practice within public sector always ask ourselves: how far do we get down into the policy development, and how far do we get down in policy implementation, right? And where those lines might be. I'm curious, maybe Wendy, we can start off with you about your views and then move on to Rahul.
Well, from my experience, I actually have sort of, I use a round circle, and I have foresight as one component of that circle. Another one is strategy, and another one is reporting. And so my view is that you actually, to be able to bring about real change, you want alignment between foresight and strategy and reporting, and that they actually should feed each other in order to bring about change. So in answer to your question, I think to bring about change requires foresight, but you also need strategy and you also need reporting. And I think reporting is when you have your pen. Strategy is when you've got sweat on your brow, because it's damn hard work, anyone that's trying to work out how to get from A to B. And foresight is fun, it's play, it's explorative. You've got a grin on your face and the sun's shining and life's a breeze. And they actually require three very different mindsets. And you know, people are often attracted to one more than the other two. And the real challenge in terms of developing good public policy is a really good balance of all three.
Fantastic. Rahul?
Yeah, so if you're in foresight, we're on business of imagination, right? You're going to imagine what it's like, which is really great. You need two complementary skill sets. You need to partner with people who, number one, have power. I mean, realistically, right? You want to get stuff done, got power, and specifically, I think you should partner with people who have power in terms of resource allocation, right? They can say, here's where you go. And I think building on Wendy's point around reporting, these are often the people who are accountable and have accountable and are thinking about end states and end goals, right? So you want to partner with someone with power because they have the optimization problem in their mind and they're working on optimization, right? So your futures you're imagining, you have somebody who's optimizing. And finally, the third kind of people you want to partner with are the people who are the builders. You need to be, if you want anything to gain traction, it needs to be there. It needs to be tangible. Other people need to be feeling it and experiencing what it feels like to live in the future. So you need to work with people who can operationalize things, who think about building. It can be tech, it can be non-tech, but they need to be able to put something out there so people are like, okay, like I get it. This is what my world would be like without this, and this is what my world is like with this. So if you're in futures, make sure you partner with somebody else who's optimizing and somebody else who's building too, and then you have the complete package.
I like
it. Actually, you know, that resource allocation question is such an important one, you know, because I think also the way that we traditionally do budgeting makes it very difficult to take into account this emergence, right? And how to, you know, and I think one of the things we also often talk about is how do you do it in a portfolio kind of way, right? It's like, you know, setting aside X% for training, you know, it's an investment kind of idea, right? You know, so setting aside X% for innovation, you know, that's not traditionally the way that we submit our budgets, you know, but in terms of a disciplined way of thinking about the portfolio that you need to be investing in for the future to be ready, I think is also an important set of conversations as well. You know, we always say, you know, at the school that futures is a team sport, you know, so if the whole government were full of futurists, it would be chaos and nobody would get anything done. You know, no practical skills, right? You know, so it's like you need to find friends, right, and build your A-team, Avengers team, and not everybody has to be like you. And I think that's such an important distinction. Wonderful. Okay, I would like to get to another question. Let me just pull it up in the chat again. You know, and this one is a little bit, it's for Wendy. So Shukwe asked about successive changes in government and whether or not that's changed the trajectory of New Zealand's foresight planning. I think one of the really interesting things about the long-term briefing reports, and in some sense the national scenarios in Singapore also play a similar role, is that it creates a conversation, you know, between stakeholders, right? You know, and kind of legitimizes a process for the civil service to come in and talk about, you know, what the future of the country should look like, right? So that's the first part of the question. I think the second part is around whether or not futures thinking and planning work shared through collaborations with other Commonwealth states. You know, whether it's you know, exchange of ideas or anything that might benefit from larger economies of scale. I was really curious about that.
Oh, they're both really interesting questions. I'm terribly interested in developing a framework for scenarios for New Zealand that I'm calling under the title reference scenarios. I think the real value add is if we have, like, we've got a list, we've just done a big table of scenarios that the New Zealand government produces and local government, and there's probably a list of about 50 scenarios, but we don't have a framework that number one, you can find them all in one place, or secondly, that you've got some sort of even sorting of climate ones versus, say, education scenarios, something that actually has some sort of time scale that sets some sort of context. And I think that that would be a really useful model, particularly in terms of, so in a little abbreviation, the accountant in me, TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a reporting model for companies to report against a framework like an accounting standard. I won't go into too much detail, but the point being that part of that the TCFD is actually to report against scenarios, in this case climate scenarios. So the ability, it's almost like we haven't designed a scenario framework within a country that enables us to have a shared understanding of the future. And I think that's a terribly exciting idea and something that could be taken globally. Now, Singapore has the closest I know to that, in that you've created the national scenarios. And so you can kind of sort of probably see where I'm going. So that's just one of the things I'm trying to bring about and change in New Zealand, and see if we can get an appetite and have a go at that. In terms of like the Commonwealth, we definitely we do try and imitate and learn from Singapore. We do have a very strong relationship still with the Commonwealth, and particularly with England in terms of public policy. I'm sure they never look at us, but we definitely look at them to see their successes and failures. And I think that we sort of follow them sometimes 10 or 15 years behind them, and hopefully pick up all their lessons learned. So it's a very, I think the world has never been closer to New Zealand in many ways, in the lessons that we can learn and the expertise that's actually out there that we try and learn from.
Yeah, fantastic. I've just suddenly become very aware of the time and realizing also how late it is for Wendy, who is coming in from New Zealand. So maybe if it's okay with everybody, we'll start to wrap up the conversation. I think one of the things I would love to hear from the two of you is, I mean, do you have one piece of advice, after all this is said and done, one piece of advice for, I suppose, policymakers who are looking at increasing the impact of foresight work? We'd be really curious as one practical thing that we can do when we go to work tomorrow. Maybe I'll start with Rahul and then go to Wendy.
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest learning I had is really, as futurists, you cannot limit yourself to saying, I've painted the pictures of the future and like you do what you will with that, right? That just doesn't work. Because it's often so complex and there's so many driving forces intermingled, it's hard to grapple with what does that mean for me. And so it is your responsibility, if you're a futurist or if you're a policymaker, to build that bridge from the future into the present, to say, hey, if there are elements of these that we don't want, what are we going to do so that we avoid that scenario? If there are elements of this scenario that we like, what are we going to do to make this our reality? Right? And that is non-trivial, right? To be able to do that, to help people to walk that bridge from there, from that future into how that is going to look like in the present, and what do we need to do about it, right? So that involves holding their hand, having facilitated sessions to walk them through what does that look like how could we get there, how could we have gotten there, and therefore how should we respond in such a way that we get to potentially a different place if we wanted to. So that is your responsibility. Take that as your responsibility to do that and help them work through what that means for them in terms of policy. Be there to support possible options, expand their option set, right? So don't say, hey, I'm restricted to this policy, but like, why are these restrictions in place? Challenge those assumptions and help open up the policy space so that they have more options than they came with when they met you.
Fantastic, wonderful piece of advice. Wendy,
Well, mine is to have an interesting life, and and I'll explain that as quickly as I can. So you kind of have a choice, and the way that you have an interesting life, or that I have learned, is that you really connect with your curiosity. You seek out information and knowledge, and you kind of, going back to the concept of the game, it's a game. It's like, oh my gosh, there's this whole world out there. I'm really curious and I want to find out about things. So I would say go for interesting, go for curious. And the last one is go for cool. And when I talk about that, is find the cool people and hang out with them and forget about the uncool people. And try and pretend you're cool, even if you're not. But if they're cool, yeah, that's where you want to be, because that's great. That's what life's about. And Foresight is very much about finding those people and hanging out and being curious. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. So build bridges to and with cool people. Love it. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Wendy and Rahul. I think it's been such a wonderful conversation, and I think for me, it's so much of this practical. How does it actually work in the real world, right? And hearing examples both from Singapore as well as New Zealand, I think it's been really, really interesting and wonderful. I think one of the big takeaways that we have doing these sessions, right, is we like to invite a diversity in the panel, and there's so many different ways of doing futures work in public policy. But I think the thing I always take away is how passionate and how thoughtful and intentional people are about building new futures for their countries in whatever shape or form that takes. And I think that that's such a wonderful way also to end our 2021 season finale of Futures Forward webinar. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. Virtual round of applause for both Rahul and Wendy. This is the sad thing about doing these things virtually, is that you don't know who is in the audience. But thank you so much, really do appreciate that. If you just allow me a couple of closing remarks. So we really do appreciate feedback, and thank you so much for joining us. Please let us know your thoughts by scanning the QR code below and giving us a little bit of feedback. We will go over the next two months or so into full-on prep mode for season 2, which will be a lot more topical in focus. So season 1, we focus very much on public policy and futures, public management kind of perspectives. But if you've got ideas for topics and so on, we'll be raring to go again in 2022. Maybe next slide, if everybody's got the QR code. The other thing that we're doing here at the school is really trying to ramp up our community events. So really thankful, for the support of all of you, in terms of different things that are happening. So we are organizing a Futures Community Conference, which we would love for you to attend. There's another QR code if you would like to register. So that's the first item on the list, 24th of November. This will be online, so do welcome also participation from outside Singapore. And we are scheduling the next Futures Forward webinar. Again, this would be something that's a bit more topical. Season 2, 23rd of February seems like a little bit far away, but please take note of that if you can. Wonderful. I think that was our last slide. Am I right? Nope. Just bringing this conversation from the Executive Education Department at the Lee Kuan Yew School. So we do run executive education programs. I'm really happy to have you join us. I do see a lot of people who are in our current program, so thank you very much for your support. And if you're interested in any of these things, please let us know as well. And last thing, please connect with us. We love to collaborate. So if you're into Futures collaborations, you want to know more about our programs, or you would like to just see what we are up to on a day-to-day basis across all our teams, you can see that on LinkedIn. Again, more QR codes. If you're interested, please, we really love to keep in touch. That's also one of the ways that you can be informed of our future events as well. Okay, that's all from us. Once again, thank you very much, both Wendy and Rahul. Wishing everybody best of luck on their futures journey. I hope that the conversation today has given you a lot of food for thought, about really just this question of impact, right? And how do we make impact in the real world with these tools that we have, futures, and in the context of the public sector and public policy work. I do hope that it gives you some thoughts and reflections of how you might be able to take that into your context and make the change that you want to make. So that's all from us at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and thank you very much. Really appreciate all of your attention and time today. So see you soon, and at least from the webinar perspective, see you in February 2022. Thank you very much.